Boy, do I sure love video games. But despite PCs probably being the better option, I've always had a hard spot for consoles. One of the worst parts about consoles, though, is that there's just way too many of them. So whenever I'm in the mood for some good old sloppy gaming, it's hard for me to pick which platform I want to play on. So that's why I gathered the world's top scientists and my Uncle Ricky to try and sort this mess out once and for all by dividing the most notable consoles up into tiers. Which is an innovative concept that I came up with completely by myself, and it's never been done before. So let's work our way up from the bottom, starting with the worst consoles in the F tier. The Magnavox Odyssey. The only console I can think of worthy of a spot at the very bottom has to be the Magnavox Odyssey, because while I do appreciate it for being the very first home console ever made, I can't honestly say that what this thing plays are video games. Because pretty much everything is just this light on the screen, and to be honest, if I were alive when this came out, I'd probably just rather read a book or die than play it. I should probably go easy on the Odyssey, but I'm trying to judge these consoles based on merit alone. So with that being the criteria, the Magnavox Odyssey belongs in the Hell tier all by itself. But now let's move on to the E tier, where the consoles still suck, but I'd at least count them as video games. The Atari 2600. Despite how important this was for the history of video games, blah 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 blah, I've gotta say that the Atari 2600 just isn't any fun to play with the options we have today. I would be worried about getting heat for saying that, but to be honest, I don't think anybody actually cares about this thing. And I seriously doubt that most people who say they love the Atari 2600 actually play it. Most games just kinda have you doing one thing on one screen with no real purpose in mind, like Hong Kong 97 on the Super Famicom. But if I'm being completely honest, I'd actually rather play that, because at least it's entertainingly bad as opposed to just being flat out boring. Doing one task over and over again might work for games with scores, but whenever you turn the power off, the high scores are erased anyway. So if you want to prove to people you got a high score in a game nobody gives a shit about, then your best option is to take a picture of the screen or just play something else. And while we're on the subject of Atari, let's just go ahead and get this all out of the way now with the Atari 5200, the 7800, and Jaguar, or Jaguar as it was known in the UK. The 5200 was so bad that its predecessor, the 2600, actually outlived it. Then there's the 7800, which is significantly more powerful than its predecessors. I'd say the graphics are comparable to the NES, which is actually pretty impressive considering the system was finished a few years before it was even released. But unlike the NES, there just aren't any notable games you really need to play. The Jaguar's a little better though, with some great versions of Doom and Wolfenstein among a few other games. If you happen to find a Jaguar laying in your dad's reading material, then there is a lot of fun to be had. But it's really not worth going out of your way to buy a Jaguar just so you could play some games that didn't age well. The 3DO. Basically copy and paste everything I said about the Jaguar. The Commodore 64. For some reason, this is considered to be a console, even though it looks like a PC to my dumbass. I do appreciate the Commodore 64 for what it is, and there are a few pretty good games here and there like Ghosts and Goblins and Bubble Bobble, but ultimately, I think you're just better off playing an NES. While we're talking about Nintendo though, let's not forget about their biggest blunder of all time, the Virtual Boy. Honestly, I think the controller's underrated, but it's pretty much impossible to defend a console with 3 games that were good but not great. Especially when it gives you migraines, neck pains, and diarrhea if you play it too long. Let's move on to the D tier though, where the consoles actually have qualities that hold up, but are ultimately underwhelming. The Sega Game Gear. Thanks to a good marketing campaign, the Sega Game Gear convinced a lot of unruly children with shit stains on their lower backs that the Game Boy was trash just because it couldn't play games in color. But when you look past the colored screen, the Game Gear really didn't have a whole lot else going for it. The games are all right, I guess, but whenever you ask the average gamer what games define the Game Gear, you never really get a straight answer. Then you throw in the fact that it chugs AA batteries faster than my girlfriend Randy chugs cough medicine, and it makes the Game Gear very easy to overlook. Especially when most of them don't even work anymore. The Atari Lynx. I can pretty much say all the same things about the Lynx that I said about the Game Gear aside from the great marketing, which is probably why the average person doesn't have any idea what a Lynx is. The Jaguar might technically be better, but the best games on that console actually aged worse than the Lynx. And, well, you know, it's not portable, so there's that. The Sega Master System. The Master System competed directly with the NES, and its hardware was actually a little more capable. The multiplats that Nintendo couldn't bully third parties into keeping off the Master System usually looked better, and there were even a handful of good exclusives. Other than a handful of games though, there really isn't a whole lot from this console that stands the test of time. Not enough to make you go out of your way to get a hold of one of these at least. And if you're gonna try to look me in the ass and call me a liar for saying that, then why don't more people know what the Master System is? Even though people don't know about the Master System though, people do know about the Sega Saturn. Most people don't really remember the Saturn all that fondly, but it did have a handful of standout games like Nights into Dreams, Panzer Dragoon, plenty of on-rail shooters, excellent arcade ports, the best versions of Resident Evil 1 and Mega Man 8, and you know what, the CD player was pretty fun too. And if you could read Japanese, there's an assload of good RPGs you could play as well. But despite how much gold the Saturn did offer, the rest of the library's kinda trash. And don't even get me started on the fact that it didn't have an original Sonic game. And with it being so expensive in 2019, it's kinda hard to justify the price when there's other consoles that are better and cheaper. Which is why I'm ranking it relatively low on my own personal list, despite the fact that I like it. The last D-tier console I've gotta mention though is the original Xbox. Admittedly, I never owned one back in the day, but aside from playing Halo at Brian Began's house, there really weren't any exclusives that I cared about. Pretty much every great game you could get on the Xbox, you could also get on the PS2 or GameCube, and both of those consoles had plenty of their own exclusives on top of that. Plus the controller sucks weenie because it has this stupid-ass thing on the end. You know, this thing. Now onto the C tier, where things are looking pretty good. The Turbograf X16, aka the PC engine. When the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis were punching each other in the asses, the Turbograf X16 was pretty much known as, oh yeah, that thing. I like to think of this console as the hidden gem machine, because even I'm surprised at what I find whenever I look into it further. Rather than just having a bunch of multiplats you could also get on the SNES and Genesis, the TurboGrafx had plenty of original games made by Hudson, like the Zelda ripoff Newtopia, the Bonk's Adventure series, and assloads upon assloads of amazing shooters like R-Type. Sadly though, it's expensive as hell because it was only released in a handful of cities for like 5 minutes. And in addition to the steep asking price, I personally don't think it's as good as Nintendo and Sega's consoles from the same era. But it'd be hard to argue with anyone who disagreed with that statement because there certainly is a lot to love here. Thankfully, its high price probably won't really be much of an issue once Konami releases the TurboGrafx Mini though. The Neo Geo. This console's pretty interesting since it's technically the first hybrid, but rather than being a console combined with a handheld like the Switch or Sega Nomad, it was actually half console, half arcade. And like you'd expect with an arcade board that had interchangeable cartridges, it was expensive as hell when it first came out at $650. And that was all the way back in 1990, but if you adjusted it for inflation, in 2019 it cost $674,000. But no one ever really seemed to mind the high price, because this was really more for arcade owners to be able to get new games a lot more conveniently with cartridges, rather than buying entirely new cabinets. It was never really meant for consumers, and SNK really didn't care if the average person could afford it. But if you happen to be rich in the early 90s, then this is an excellent console that still holds up pretty well today. But with most of the games being ported to other consoles since then, there's really no justification for the high price. The Neo Geo Pocket Color. Alright, I'm gonna count the Neo Geo Pocket and Pocket Color as one thing, just like I would with the new 3DS and 64 with an expansion pack. Now that I got that out of the way though, I've gotta admit, I kinda got the chubs for the Neo Geo Pocket. It originally came out in 1999 while the Game Boy Color was still running wild, and despite the graphics being way more impressive, it still only cost $70. It's got a good handful of solid games like Metal Slug, Biomotor Unitron, and even an interesting Sonic the Hedgehog title. But as much as I love the Neo Geo Pocket Color, it never really came that close to reaching its full potential. The Nintendo 64. Oh, I'm sure I'm gonna get a lot of heat for putting this in the C tier, but I welcome any and all hate you've got, so bring it on in the comments below, you bastards. I'm sorry, I forgot to take my pills today. I really don't want to bury the 64 too hard, because I actually do love it, but this console came out in the era where everyone was trying to figure 3D gaming out. It's basically the very beginning of what eventually became the modern games we see today. And as far as that goes, I do appreciate the hell out of the 64, but most of its key games got way better later on. Mario 64 was one of the first times 3D platforming was done right, and the game definitely does hold up pretty well today. But I'm sorry, the camera is just way too awkward, and the power-ups don't really compare to anything you could find in Odyssey, Galaxy, or even Flood in Mario Sunshine. I look at Mario 64 the exact same way I look at Super Mario Bros. On the NES. It was an amazing first try at a new genre, but like I said, things just got way better later on. The same can be said for Smash Bros, first-person shooters, and I don't care what nostalgia says, Mario Kart 64 is definitely not the best in the series. Some of the games do hold up today, like my second favorite Zelda of all time, Majora's Mask, and obviously my favorite 3D collectathon, Banjo-Kazooie. And I didn't play either of those two games till the 64 was long dead, so don't even try hitting me with nostalgia. But even though the 64's got a handful of games that hold up, like 85% of the library is way below par in 2019. And to top it all off, I think the 64's got the worst controller of all time out of all the consoles that matter. Don't get me wrong, the analog stick and rumble pack changed gaming forever, and nowadays you can just use a HoriPad or one of the aftermarket controllers, so it's really not that big of a deal anymore. But I don't know, I always thought having 3 handles just felt weird, especially when you're supposed to hold it from the middle. I mean, just look at this, it's like dead weight hanging off the side. I am gonna give the 64 a lot of points for having so many different colors, though. Nostalgia practically begged and eventually threatened me not to put the 64 here, but since I almost never find myself playing it these days, I really can't justify putting it any higher. The Wii U. I'm sure a lot of you are probably thinking, the Wii U, more like the PU. But I actually originally listed this in the B tier because despite the console's shortcomings, it does have some really good games. But when I remembered most of the best games got enhanced ports on the Switch with the rest of the library likely to follow, I couldn't help but feel like it watered the Wii U's appeal down since it's not even portable and a lot of the games force you to use the gamepad. Sometimes it made games better like Pikmin 3, which I'm 100% convinced has better controls than Pikmin 4 will. Now what could I say, I'm a sucker for Nintendo Land even though I've never had a chance to actually play it with anybody. But for the most part, the Wii U's just becoming more and more pointless to own as time goes on. Still though, if you come across one for cheap or find yourself in a situation where it's your only option, then you're definitely gonna have a great time with what I consider consider to be some of the best games ever made. Plus, for whatever it's worth, it is backwards compatible with the Wii. But now let's get to the juicier B tier with consoles that I actually play from time to time. The PSP. The PSP is actually pretty beastly for a portable, even in 2019. And it's also got plenty of original games from franchises like Metal Gear Solid, God of War, Full House, Final Fantasy, Grand Theft Auto, and even though it's more convenient to do on your phone, it's still a pretty decent way to watch movies and TV shows if you come across any of their physical releases. Not that you'd ever want to do that or anything, but if you were trapped in a bomb shelter for like a year, there's a lot worse things you could do for entertainment than watch Joe Dirt on a PSP. I guess now's the part I gotta say bad things about it though, because it's not on a higher tier. But the only reason it's not on a higher tier is because while the PSP does have a lot of good games, consoles in the A and S tier just have a lot more to offer. At least if you ask my fat ass anyway. The NES. Arcades that came before the NES were great, but this is what I consider to be the very, very beginning of true console gaming, at least for games in 2 dimensions anyway. These kinds of games got better on the Super Nintendo and even on modern consoles that replicate the same style, but the reason I put the NES higher than the 64 is because rather than Nintendo supporting it all on their own, they had assloads of help from third parties. And that obviously led to a lot more games, and while quality is always going to be more important than quantity, sometimes quantity gives you more chances of producing quality. The NES had a lot more bad games than the 64, and even the worst 64 games are still a hell of a lot better than the 100 worst NES games. But ignoring all the bad games on both consoles isn't that big of a deal. And when you look at all the good games on the NES, it's easy to think of 100 of them that are at least moderately fun to play, with half of them being pretty good to great. There's a lot of games on the NES Classic Edition that people are furious about not making the cut, but when you think about which game should be on the inevitable 64 mini, it's actually pretty hard to come up with 20 or 30. The bottom line is that while a lot of the most popular NES games don't really hold up anymore, there's still a lot of them that are always going to be fun to play. The Game Boy Color. So even though a lot of the most popular NES games don't really hold up anymore, you might think it's blasphemous for me to say that I'm not going to consider nostalgia and have the audacity to put the Game Boy and Game Boy Color higher than the 64 and Xbox. But Nintendo's first handheld was supported for like 37 years. And in those 56 years, there were countless amazing, original, and exclusive games. Not to mention a lot of the watered-down NES ports were still pretty good sometimes. But with developers having so much time to get familiar with the hardware, a lot of the games ended up looking amazing considering the limitations. Plus, it's region-free. Who doesn't like that, right? The games might be a little simplistic, but if that's what you're in the mood for, then the Game Boy's got you covered. Just make sure your screen's properly lit by any means necessary. The Wii. As if you weren't mad enough about the Game Boy Color being higher than the 64, putting the Wii of all things in the B tier sure to cause World Wars 3, 4, and 5. But if you just forget about the loads and loads of trash on the Wii, there's actually a lot of top-notch games and hidden gems. The Wii Remote and Nunchuck might be annoying more often than not, but when it actually makes sense, these controls could really make games a lot better, or at the very least not make them worse. You might wonder why the Wii U's not technically higher since it could play the entire Wii library in addition to its own, but I'm not trying to consider backwards compatibility too much on this list. And even if I were, the Wii's still backwards compatible with the GameCube, so suck on that, Charlie. Unfortunately, like most home consoles, the Wii's not region-free, which is a real shame because I've been wanting to play that Case Closed game for over a decade, and mark my ass, someday I will. Genesis/Mega Drive, and while we're at it, the Sega CD and 32X, cause frig it. When you talk about the Genesis, most people only think about the Sonic games, which is really unfortunate because the Genesis had a hell of a lot more going on. A lot of the Super Nintendo's library was also on the Genesis, and while the Super Nintendo versions were typically better, it usually wasn't by all that much as long as you had a 6-button controller for fighting games. Oh, and the Genesis multiplats usually sounded a lot worse too, which is pretty unfortunate because games specifically made for the Genesis sounded amazing. The last thing I'm going to say about the Genesis though is while I do think multiplats were a little better on the SNES, I love that a lot of them were completely different on the Genesis. Rather than just getting ports of Contra 3, Castlevania 4, or Turtles in Time, Sega got new and original games from the same franchises like Contra Hard Corps, Castlevania Bloodlines, and Hyperstone Heist to name a few. Whether or not they're better is up for interpretation, but at least they were different rather than just being watered down ports. It might be hypocritical of me to put the Wii U so low for most of its games being ported over to the Switch, yet leaving the Genesis so high despite all of its best games being ported onto pretty much everything ever. But meh, the Genesis ports never really felt all that grand, and it's a relatively cheap console to collect for anyway compared to the Wii U, where you might as well just buy a Switch. The PS3/Xbox 360. I think the PS3 is definitively better than the 360. Besides Gears and Halo, it's got way more exclusives, plus it doesn't break 50% of the time. But most of why the PS3 is in the B tier is because of the games that were also on the 360. So even though I do think that console's actually worse, it's not really fair for me to put it any lower. This console generation's probably not old enough to be nostalgic yet, but to me, this is when developers are really hitting their stride in 3D gaming. And it's also the point in video game history where graphics reach the everything looks fine milestone. So from this point forward, visuals were less important than ever. There may have been way too many first-person shooters, but most of them were pretty good, even if the genre was a little overrated. I'm not going to list every good game, but the reason these consoles aren't higher is because they're still watered-down versions of the PS4 and Xbox One. And even though those consoles were a little bit better, I still don't really understand why we needed them so soon. But as far as the PS3 and Xbox 360 are concerned, the libraries don't exactly stand out in comparison. Regardless, though, the fact is that the PS4 and Xbox One are better, which makes the PS3 and Xbox 360 libraries not really stand out as much. Most of the best games on the PS3 or Xbox 360 either got enhanced ports for the next generation, or their sequels were just superior in every way, which makes the PS3 and Xbox 360 feel a little obsolete. I mean, I can't honestly picture ever playing my PS3 again. Plus, a lot of the games need patches, so these machines aren't really gonna hold up as well if I ever update this video in like 20 years. As obsolete as these consoles feel, though, either of them could probably keep you entertained for the rest of your life if they're all you have. But now let's move on to the A tier, where if you don't like any of these consoles, then that means you're a straight-up bad person. The Dreamcast. It's pretty incredible for this console to have had as many great games as it did when it was really only alive for about 2 years. Some of the titles don't really hold up, but for the most part they all do, especially if you like arcade and specifically fighting games. It's also got plenty of weird stuff too, like one of my favorite games ever, Typing of the Dead, where instead of using a light gun, you use a keyboard to type words out to shoot zombies. It's as stupid as it sounds, but trust me, it's a lot of fun. And I honestly don't know why schools don't use this for typing classes. I know there's blood, but kids see far worse shit on the internet anyway. The only kids who'd be genuinely offended by this are probably doomed once they reach the real world. If anything, at least put it in high schools, damn it, because this game would guaranteed create faster typists for the world. Just like the Dreamcast will make you a better person. And if you're still not satisfied with 2 years worth of official games, then indie developers are still supporting the system today. I mean, not really that often or anything, but it's still pretty cool to me. The Super Nintendo. This is probably in most people's S tier, and the only reason it barely didn't make it into mine is because it just can't provide the same kinds of games that were only possible in the next era of gaming. And what I mean by that are essentially 3D games, which most of my favorite games happen to be. With that being said though, the Super Nintendo absolutely perfected the kinds of games it was capable of, with many of my other favorite games being among them. The NES was really important for gaming history, but like I said earlier, many of its legendary games just don't hold up today. However, out of all the legendary Super Nintendo games, pretty much all of them are just as fun to play today as they were back then. Games like A Link to the Past, Chrono Trigger, Mega Man X, Home Improvement, and Super Metroid are still some of the best games, period. Gaming may have created many new genres since thanks to hardware improvements, but the Super Nintendo does just about everything it's capable of as good as it could have possibly been done. The Game Boy Advance. Nintendo's handhelds have always kind of been written off as lesser than, but I've almost always preferred them, because not only were they cheaper and portable, but they've always had great third-party support, and the Game Boy Advance is no exception. And not only that, but ever since the 64 came out, Nintendo home consoles always kind of thought they were too cool for simplistic types of games. Mainly the kinds I talked about the Super Nintendo perfecting. But despite home consoles mainly focusing on 3D, handhelds have always seemed to be the place to keep that type of gaming alive. And that's pretty much why I love the Game Boy Advance so much, because it was kind of like a Super Nintendo too. And I'm not just saying that because all the ports it got from that console. All the original games made for the Game Boy Advance just feel like they would have been made on the Super Nintendo if gaming never progressed for some reason. And I think that's awesome, not for nostalgic purposes, because 2D style gaming's simply different rather than inferior. And the GBA did a wonderful job at keeping 2D Metroid, Castlevania, Zelda, and Mother alive, while also giving us games like Golden Sun. The PS2. This console's got over 3,800 games, and even though about 80 to 90% of them are trash like with any other console, 10 to 20% still means hundreds of good to great games. And the best part's that most of them are pretty cheap in the aftermarket, and the console ain't too expensive itself. Plus, it doesn't hurt that you can watch VHS tapes on it either. The PS2 didn't make the S tier because a lot of its best games just got way better later on, but since most of them don't feel incomplete or anything like that, I wouldn't say the PS2's dated either. And with there being more great games and hidden gems to count, you can't deny the console's place in history. The GameCube. Even though I think the PS1's way better than the 64, I've always preferred the GameCube over the PS2. For every good game on the GameCube, the PS2 probably has about 20 to 30, but like I said earlier, most PS2 games just got way better later on, which does make them feel a tad dated today. Meanwhile, the GameCube's got plenty of games that were either considered the best in their franchises like Paper Mario, Metroid Prime, F-Zero, and Luigi's Mansion at least for now. Or if the games on the GameCube weren't the best in their franchise, they were usually at least different enough to stand on their own, rather than feeling watered down in hindsight compared to their modern sequels. Plus, the controller was awesome, and along with the console, they came in plenty of different colors, which is always something I love. The PS Vita. Considering I've only played Persona 4 Golden, even I've gotta admit it's kinda bullshit this is in the A tier. But even though I've beaten that game 4 times and it's my second favorite game ever, that's not why the Vita made it so high. I just think it's a neat high quality console, really. It feels amazing to hold, the graphics are incredible even today, and there's assloads upon assloads of really good games, with many of them being exclusives. I may not have played it all that much just yet, but I definitely plan to brush up on it sometime. And maybe then I'll even consider it for the S tier, or I guess B tier if it ends up sucking. But speaking of S tier, we're at the, well, S tier. You know, best consoles ever. According to me, anyway. The PS1. I know I gave the 64 a lot of shit for its games not holding up in 2019, and yeah, thanks to developers trying to pioneer 3D gaming, a lot of the PS1 games don't hold up either. But as opposed to Nintendo just trying to do it all by themselves, Sony had all the third-party support in the world back then, which ultimately led to way more hits. And a lot of the developers weren't even trying to pioneer anything, some of them just made tried-and-true games that knew would be a hit. The PS1's strongest point by far are all the hidden gems. It'd probably take me years to finish all the games I got on the PS1 back burner, and for that reason alone it deserves to be in the S tier, even if Sony did kinda botch it with the PS1 Mini. The Nintendo DS. Even with the original DS being as popular as it is, I still think it's underrated as hell. Unlike Wii remote controls being hit or miss, the dual screens and touch controls almost always made games better, and a lot of the times, developers got pretty creative with it, and that definitely helps it stand out and hold up in the modern day. Plus, the gimmicks also gave the DS a wide variety of genres with a great balance between quantity and quality. There's way too many games to list here, but if you had access to the DS and its entire library and couldn't find at least 20 games you'd enjoy, then I'd legitimately question whether or not you like video games. The 3DS. The 3DS doesn't have as much quantity as the original DS did, but the quality's noticeably higher. With the 3DS's graphics reaching the everything looks fine milestone, games always felt like they had full effort put into them, rather than sometimes feeling like handheld spin-offs. But that doesn't mean simplistic 2D-styled games or touch controls didn't exist on it like they did in the original DS. And in addition to those kinds of games, the 3DS had plenty of titles that wouldn't have felt out of place on a home console, which is why a lot of the games were actually ported over to home consoles unchanged. And the interesting part's that nobody even cares that the games weren't enhanced, and due to the fact that handheld games were being ported over to home consoles, there really wasn't a reason to divide the libraries up anymore. In fact, I firmly believe that the 3DS is the main reason the Wii U died. The 3D feature didn't really matter, but it was kinda cool and it never once hurt a game. And even though Street Pass is kinda dying off, it's still great while it's around. And I hope people keep bringing their 3DSs to conventions for years to come, because I've still got a lot of birthdays to fill and I refuse to cheat. Probably the best part about the 3DS, though, is that currently it's cheap as hell to collect for, especially if you don't mind digital games, because they're basically giving AAA titles away on the eShop. If you've never played a 3DS, then stop being a turkey dingus and just buy one, because it's definitely a console I'm never gonna get rid of. The PS4/Xbox One. Same as with the PS3 and Xbox 360, I'm mainly gonna be talking about the PS4, but since the Xbox One's library is close enough, it still deserves to be in the S tier. I feel like it's not really considered cool to put modern consoles so high, but everything that was great about the PS3 and Xbox 360 is just way better on the PS4 and Xbox One. Not necessarily the graphics, since they're really only like 1.4% better. But in my honest opinion, games are just way better now than they've ever been before. I mean, look at Arkham Knight and 2018 Spider-Man. That's probably the closest we're ever gonna get to being Batman or Spider-Man, and that's pretty goddamn incredible. And when you look at games like Grand Theft Auto 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, and God of War, just to name a few, it's hard to deny that this console generation's the best ever without nostalgia being involved. The Nintendo Switch. Some people are probably mad the Switch is in the S tier, while others probably would have tried to assassinate me at the Youth Chili Cook-Off had I placed it any lower. But even though I did put it in the S tier, I wouldn't disagree that the Switch is a little overrated. Like I said before, graphics are less important now than they've ever been before, but unless I'm planning on playing a game on the go, I'm just gonna get it on the PS4 if it means better performance and visuals. Especially if it's cheaper and most of the game needs to be downloaded onto the Switch anyway. But just because I think it's overrated doesn't mean I don't consider it to be one of the best consoles ever made. Because not only are all the greatest games from every console ever, including the Sega CD, being ported over, but there's also poop loads of great original content less than 3 years into the console's life. And there really is something for everybody. Plus, with so many more games on the way, the Switch's status as an S-tier console is only going to get cemented that much more. But there you have it, that's my console tier list. F tier is the Magnavox Odyssey all by itself. The E tier is the Atari 2600, 5200, 7800, Jaguar, 3DO, and Commodore 64. The D tier is the Game Gear, Lynx, Master System, Saturn, and Xbox. The C tier is the Turbograf X16, Neo Geo Pocket Color, Nintendo 64, and the Wii U. The B tier is the PSP, NES, Game Boy Color, Wii, Genesis/Mega Drive, and the PS3/Xbox 360. The A tier is the Dreamcast, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, PS2, GameCube, and PS Vita. And finally, the S tier is the PS1, PS4, Xbox One, DS, 3DS, and Switch. Regardless of whether or not you agree with me though, I hope you enjoyed the video, which was of course brought to you by today's patrons of the day, Justin D and Dojin Shinji. What do you think about my list though? Is it gonna get me killed next time I go outside? Am I gonna get my ass whooped for leaving consoles like the Vectrex, WonderSwan, and ColecoVision off? Or was my list absolutely perfect and deserving of an Emmy? Either way, let me know what your list is in the comments below and I'll respond to every single person. Thanks for watching though. If you came over from FU Game Crew, I'm still gonna upload videos to that channel as well. But I plan on getting a little weird on this channel from time to time. And now that I finally finished working on this video, I'm definitely gonna upload here more often. My name's Cameron, all one word, and I'll see you next time.